The first light of June 6, 1944, broke over the English Channel with a grey and restless sky. Salt spray lashed against steel hulls, stinging the faces of men who knew they were about to step into history. The sea was angry that morning, 5-foot swells tossing the landing craft like toys. Yet inside every vessel hearts pounded harder than the waves. There were farm boys from Kansas, factory hands from Detroit, and students who had put down their books to shoulder rifles. Ahead of them lay Omaha Beach, one of the most heavily fortified stretches of coastline in the world. And behind them, roaring through the spray with a grim inevitability, came the machines that would change the battle, the American Sherman tanks. To the Germans watching from the bluffs above, the scene looked deceptively familiar. They had spent 2 years building the Atlantic Wall, a network of bunkers, machine gun nests, and anti-tank guns, all designed to make Normandy a graveyard for Allied soldiers. In their doctrine, tanks were the kings of the battlefield, and in their arrogance, they believed their Panthers and Tigers, sleek, brutal predators of steel, could never be matched by the crude machines the Americans brought across the sea. German officers scoffed at the Sherman, calling it a death trap with thin armor and an underpowered gun. They expected to slaughter them by the dozens, just as they had done to Soviet T-34s on the Eastern Front. But on that storm-tossed morning, a decision made by Captain Ned Elder of the 743rd Tank Battalion changed everything. The plan had been for the Shermans to swim ashore, using canvas flotation screens stretched around their hulls. But Elder saw the seas. He knew the waves would swallow the tanks before they reached land. Against orders, he chose not to launch them into the water. Instead, his 32 Shermans would ride their landing craft all the way to the sand. It was a choice that saved hundreds of lives, though he could not have known it at the time. Where other battalions watched their tanks vanish beneath the waves, Elder's would thunder straight onto the beach, tracks grinding against wet shingle. For the Germans in wider Stansenist 62, overlooking Omaha's easy red sector, the sight was shocking. They had prepared their kill zones with mathematical precision, overlapping arcs of machine gun fire, pre-sighted artillery coordinates, and anti-tank guns hidden behind concrete embrasures. They were ready to slaughter infantrymen by the thousands. What they had not prepared for, what they had never truly believed could happen, was the sudden arrival of dozens of American tanks rumbling through smoke and chaos, defying every calculation. One gunner later admitted, "We expected men. Instead, we saw monsters coming out of the sea. And these monsters, though flawed, carried with them the quiet genius of American industry. Each Sherman had been built not to impress on paper, but to endure in war. They could be repaired with a wrench and a hammer, fueled with ordinary gasoline, and produced by the thousands every month. Against German perfection stood American pragmatism, and on that beach, it was pragmatism that mattered. The first Shermans ground forward just as the naval bombardment lifted, their tracks clattering across wet steel obstacles and tangled barbed wire. German machine guns opened instantly, the vicious rattle of MG-42s spraying bullets that sparked harmlessly against armor. Infantrymen diving for cover looked up in disbelief as the tanks pressed on, shells loaded and ready. For weeks, they had been warned of near-suicidal odds. Yet here, rolling alongside them, came 75mm guns barking fire at the bunkers that had pinned them down. Fear began to give way to something else, hope. On the bluffs above, Obergefreiter Hinrich so manned one of the Atlantic Wall's most dreaded weapons, the 88mm anti-tank gun. He knew the Sherman's reputation, thin-skinned, easy prey. At 1,000 meters, his cannon could punch through one like paper. But what the manuals did not teach was the storm of chaos unfolding below. When he fired, the first round smashed into a Sherman's side, igniting ammunition in a ball of fire that shook the beach. For a moment, German defenders cheered. Yet even as one tank burned, 3 more drove forward through the smoke. Another round, another kill, and still the tide of steel did not break. For every tank that erupted in flames, others replaced it, pushing closer with grim inevitability. By 7:00 a.m., more than 40 Shermans were ashore. Some were already crippled, tracks blown off by mines, turrets jammed by shrapnel, but their crews fought on with astonishing resilience. A tank known as Barbara, commanded by Sergeant Walter Basker, had taken 7 hits in the first hour alone. Its turret traverse mechanism was destroyed, its side armor dented and leaking fuel. But Basker's crew patched it under fire, cannibalizing parts from wrecked tanks, and within minutes Barbara was back in action, spitting high-explosive rounds at German strongpoints. To the men pinned on the beach, that stubborn machine became a symbol that no matter how hard the enemy struck, the Americans would rise again. German doctrine prized perfection. Their Tigers weighed nearly 60 tons, with frontal armor that could shrug off most Allied shells. Their Panthers, armed with long-barreled 75mm guns, could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Americans' weapons barely scratched their paint. But those tanks were scarce, fuel-hungry, and prone to breakdowns. By contrast, the Sherman was no masterpiece. It was simply good enough, and there were thousands more where it came from. The Germans watched in disbelief as tank crews repaired their machines in the middle of combat, hammering bent armor back into shape, swapping gun barrels in 20 minutes, coaxing stalled engines to life under the scream of mortars. To fight Shermans was to fight not just a tank, but the entire machinery of American industry. At 8:15, Wider Stansonist 66 sent a desperate radio message. Enemy tanks on beach. Infantry decimated. Request immediate anti-tank support. But no reinforcements came. The German reserves, trapped inland by Hitler's obsession with holding back for a real invasion at Calais, could not move. On Omaha Beach, the unthinkable was happening. The Atlantic Wall, thought impregnable, was being broken not just by courage, but by sheer mechanical persistence. By mid-morning, the battlefield had transformed into a grim tableau of fire and smoke. The beach was littered with wreckage, burning landing craft, shattered vehicles, and the bodies of the fallen. Yet amidst the carnage, the Shermans pushed on. Their armor bore scars from countless impacts, blackened by soot, gouged by shells, but still they advanced. Infantrymen, who only hours before had been cowering behind hedgehog obstacles, now followed in their wake. The tanks were not invincible, but they were relentless, and in that relentlessness lay their power. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ploger, commanding the 743rd Tank Battalion C Company, ordered his crews to concentrate fire on the strongpoints overlooking the Les Moulins draw. His men employed a tactic perfected in training, first firing white phosphorus rounds to blind and terrify defenders, then hammering the bunkers with high explosive shells. The phosphorus seeped through firing slits and air vents, forcing Germans to abandon their positions or choke in blinding smoke. Survivors staggered out only to be cut down by advancing riflemen. To the defenders who had believed their fortifications unassailable, it was a nightmare, a carefully designed fortress undone by crude yet effective firepower. At 9:00 a.m., the first German armored response arrived. Two Stu III assault guns, low and squat like armored reptiles, rolled out from concealment and opened fire at 800 meters. Their long 75mm guns cracked through the chaos, punching holes in Sherman armor. Two tanks went up in flames, crews scrambling through hatches as ammunition detonated. For a moment, the German line steadied, but then the Stu GS found themselves outnumbered 5-1. A half-dozen Shermans wheeled their turrets, coordinating not by radio. Saltwater had wrecked most sets, but by hand signals and sheer instinct. Shells rained down, and within minutes the Stu GS were burning wrecks. The advantage of numbers was beginning to show, and it was a mathematics the Germans could not escape. The tide continued to shift. Combat engineers, once pinned helplessly on the beach, now worked under the cover of tanks to blast gaps through seawalls and minefields. Each explosion opened a pathway for infantry to surge inland, shielded by steel. German defenders realized too late that their intricate kill zones, designed to shred men in open sand, had no answer for armor breaking through their lines. The supposed death trap of Omaha Beach was becoming a corridor of opportunity. General Omar Bradley, watching from the deck of the USS Augusta, had nearly considered diverting his troops to Utah Beach in despair. The scene at Omaha had looked like catastrophe. But now, as smoke columns twisted skyward, he saw Shermans rolling through breaches and infantry pouring in behind them. The tide of battle was shifting before his eyes. What hours earlier had looked like failure was hardening into victory, and the catalyst was the presence of those stubborn American tanks. For the German defenders, the shock was profound. They had been trained to believe that their Tigers and Panthers were the apex predators of armored warfare, untouchable and supreme. Yet here, crude American machines, unglamorous and underestimated, were tearing open the Atlantic Wall. The myth of invincibility was cracking, just as surely as the bunkers crumbled under high explosive shells. By late morning, the Shermans were no longer confined to the sand. Engineers had blasted openings in the seawall, and tanks began grinding inland through smoke and rubble. Each hedgerow, each farmhouse, became a battleground. German doctrine demanded that attackers be pinned on the beach, where artillery and machine guns could annihilate them. But the Shermans had broken that script. Now, the fight was spilling into the countryside, where American armor and infantry began to improvise in ways the defenders could scarcely anticipate. Private First Class Charles Lombardo was one of only 2 tankers from the ill-fated 741st Tank Battalion whose amphibious, swimming Shermans had survived the Channel crossing. His machine, waterlogged and sputtering, barely made it ashore. But with grit and sheer determination, Lombardo's crew pressed forward. They closed on a concrete bunker that had stalled an entire infantry company, pouring 5 rounds of armor-piercing shells into its walls until the structure collapsed in a thunderous roar. One battered tank, thought lost before it ever touched land, had turned the tide for 150 men. To the Germans watching, it was bewildering. These tanks, they believed, should never have reached the shore. Yet here they were, smashing open the doors of their fortress. The Germans were not passive. Panzer Force teams, infantry armed with one-shot anti-tank launchers, darted between hedgerows and farm lanes, stalking Shermans at close range. Their weapons could punch through nearly 8 inches of steel, and every hedge seemed alive with lurking danger. But the Americans had learned from bitter defeats in North Africa and Sicily. This time, infantry advanced side by side with tanks, sweeping each hedgerow before a panzer force could strike. The cooperation was crude, often improvised, but it blunted the Germans' deadliest countermeasure. Every field, every ditch, became a test of nerves. Sometimes a Sherman exploded in a fireball. Other times, it was the Panzer Force team that vanished under a torrent of .30 caliber fire. At noon, German commanders realized with horror that their reserves were still far away. Panthers from the 2nd Panzer Division and Tigers from the elite 101st SS Heavy Battalion were trapped inland by Hitler's refusal to release them. He believed Normandy was a feint, convinced the real invasion would strike at Calais. His delay meant that on Omaha, the defenders stood alone, their vaunted Atlantic Wall collapsing before their eyes. Radio messages grew desperate, but no relief came. For the American tankers, exhaustion mixed with adrenaline. Salt water had ruined their radios, and many crews fought blind, each tank waging its own private war. Yet their persistence carried them forward. Sergeant Curtis Culin, a cavalryman turned tanker, studied the dense Norman hedgerows that hemmed them in. To tanks, they were death traps, earthen walls 3 feet thick, topped with tangled brush, designed centuries earlier to mark property lines. Shermans attempting to climb them exposed their vulnerable underbellies. But Culin had an idea. Why not weld the steel hedgehog, obstacles littering the beaches onto the bows of the tanks, turning them into makeshift cutters? That flash of ingenuity, born on the spot, would soon spread across the battlefield and rewrite the rules of armored combat in Normandy. By early afternoon, the German defense at Omaha Beach was unraveling. Once proud strongpoints, meticulously designed to withstand any assault, lay shattered or abandoned. Bunkers that had seemed indestructible now belched smoke, their gun crews either killed, captured, or fleeing into the countryside. And everywhere the Shermans advanced, the story repeated itself, battered, sometimes burning, yet still fighting. The tanks were no miracle weapons, but they gave the Americans what they needed most, momentum. At 1:00 p.m., reports flooded into the headquarters of General Dietrich Kreyes, commander of the German 352nd Infantry Division. His officers painted a grim picture: American armor advancing through Colville, infantry pouring inland, artillery positions silenced one after another. Kreyes pleaded for reinforcements, but his requests vanished into the bottleneck of Hitler's war machine. The vaunted panzer divisions, trapped miles away, were paralyzed by indecision and rigid orders. The defenders of Omaha realized with sinking hearts that they were being left to die where they stood. Meanwhile, on the American side, ingenuity turned desperation into innovation. Sergeant Culin's idea of welding steel prongs to the front of Sherman's spread like wildfire. By nightfall, maintenance crews were already scavenging wrecked obstacles, cutting them apart with torches and welding them onto tanks. The crude devices turned Shermans into mechanical rhinos capable of punching through the Norman hedgerows that had stalled them. What German engineers had assumed was an impenetrable natural defense suddenly became just another obstacle waiting to be solved. In a matter of days, the majority of American tanks would carry these improvised cutters, giving them the ability to carve paths through fields that had trapped them only hours before. At 4:00 p.m., the first Tiger tank finally rolled toward the front. Its arrival was meant to terrify 60 tons of armored steel with an 88mm gun that could obliterate a Sherman from over a mile away. For a moment, German morale surged. This was the weapon they believed would turn the tide. But when the Tiger engaged, the Americans responded not with fear, but with tactics. Smoke rounds masked its vision. One Sherman drew its fire from the front, and 3 others slipped through an orchard to its flank. At 200 meters, armor-piercing shells tore into the Tiger's engine compartment. Flames roared skyward as the crew abandoned their stricken beast. For the German defenders, it was a shattering sight. The tank they had considered untouchable lay burning in a French orchard, bested not by a single superior machine, but by cooperation and numbers. As evening shadows lengthened, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Americans had not only survived Omaha Beach, they had broken it. Behind them, the English Channel stretched grey and endless, a highway for reinforcements and supplies. Ahead of them lay Normandy, still riddled with danger, but open. The Atlantic Wall, the fortress Hitler promised could never be breached, had fallen in a single day. And the symbol of that breach was not the mighty Tiger or Panther, but the humble Sherman tank, scarred, imperfect, underestimated, yet unstoppable. As dusk settled over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the battlefield bore scars that would never fade. Smoke drifted across shattered villages, the stench of cordite and burning fuel clung to the air, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the hedgerows. Yet amidst the devastation, one truth stood tall. The Americans had done what many believed impossible. Omaha Beach was secure. Cost had been terrible, thousands of lives lost, dozens of tanks reduced to smoldering wrecks, but the foothold was undeniable. And the weapon that made it possible was one few Germans had ever feared, the Sherman tank. For German troops, the shock was profound. Their commanders had drilled into them the belief that the Tiger and Panther were unmatched predators, kings of the battlefield. They had laughed at the Sherman, deriding it as a Ronson lighter, a tank that lights up the first time, every time. But on this day, they witnessed a different reality. They saw Shermans absorb hit after hit and keep moving. They saw crews repair crippled machines with wrenches and hammers under enemy fire. They saw fields once thought impenetrable ripped open by improvised hedge cutters. And they saw numbers, waves of Shermans that never seemed to end, rolling off ships, rumbling across beaches, and climbing through hedgerows. For the first time, the Germans realized they were not facing a tank. They were facing an entire system, industrial might, logistical genius, and the unbreakable determination of men who refused to stop. In the days that followed, German counterattacks surged with ferocity. Panthers prowled the bocage lanes, their long guns picking off Shermans at frightening distances. Tigers lumbered into ambush positions, exacting a heavy toll on Allied armor. But for every Sherman destroyed, 2 more arrived. For every crew lost, replacements stepped forward. American doctrine did not demand perfection, it demanded persistence. And persistence was something the Sherman delivered in abundance. By August, the numbers told a story no propaganda could conceal. Where once stood the proud divisions of the Wehrmacht, now lay burned-out hulks of Tigers and Panthers, abandoned in fields and crossroads. Their crews, veterans of Kursk, masters of armored warfare, were gone, casualties of a grinding battle they could never win. The Sherman had not been the best tank of the war. It had not been the fastest, the thickest armored, or the most heavily armed. But it was the right tank for the war America fought. Reliable, adaptable, and most of all, available in overwhelming numbers. On the bluffs above Omaha today stands a monument, beside which rests a preserved Sherman from the 743rd Tank Battalion. Its hull still bears the scars of that day, dents from shells that failed to kill it, scratches from shrapnel that could not stop it. Flowers lie at its tracks, placed by generations of French families who remember liberation. The inscription is simple: to those who came in steel coffins to give us freedom. It is a reminder that history is not written only by the perfect, but by the determined. The Germans learned that lesson on June 6th. They had trusted in superiority of design. The Americans trusted in resilience, in numbers, and in the simple conviction that good enough, multiplied by thousands, can become unstoppable. And so, when the sun set on Normandy, the myth of German invincibility lay in ruins, and the humble Sherman had earned its place as the tank that won the war.